Assalamu alaikum everyone, welcome back. I'm the Muslim metaphysician, and today I'm here to talk to you guys about a very important topic. I'm very excited to talk to you guys about this, and this is relative identity Trinitarianism. Now, you guys have probably heard me use this term before. I never went into great lengths of explaining exactly what it is and how it relates to the LPT, or the logical problem of the Trinity. So today I'm going to talk to you about relative identity Trinitarianism, explain to you sort of exactly what it is and its proposed solution to the LPT, or the logical problem of the Trinity. Now, this is part 5 in my series that I've entitled Testing the Trinity, in which I'm going through the Trinity, the logical problem of the Trinity, different branches of models of the Trinity that have been proposed in order to try to make sense of the Trinity, in order to try to solve these logical puzzles that are related to the doctrine of the Trinity. And so that's what this series is all about. So, as I said, this video in particular, I'm going to be discussing relative identity Trinitarianism, which is a broad school or a broad model proposed to explain what the doctrine of the Trinity is and how it relates to the logical problem of the Trinity. So, before I get to that, I have a question for my Christian audience who are watching this. And my question for you guys are, and I want you to think about this very carefully. Are the Father and the Son the same God? Let me repeat that. Are the Father and the Son the same God? Yes or no? Now, I'll give you guys a quick few seconds to think about that before I proceed with my second question. All right? Now, keep that yes or no answer in mind. Now, are the Father and the Son the same person? I'll repeat again. Are the Father and the Son the same person? Yes or no? So, if you said yes to the first question of whether or not the Father and the Son are the same God, and you said no to the second question, whether or not the Father and the Son are the same person, then those two answers commit you to a form of what is known as relative identity Trinitarianism. Now, let me explain. But before I actually go into an explanation of why that's the case, I want to, as a reminder, briefly explain to you guys, because it's been about a month or so since I last discussed the LPT in detail. I want to explain what the logical problem of the Trinity is real fast, and how social Trinitarians respond to it. And then that will give us a clearer, hopefully, understanding of the distinction between social Trinitarians and relative identity Trinitarians in relation to the logical problem of the Trinity and how they solve this problem differently. So what was the LPT? The LPT, as formulated by Dr. Bo Branson, who I debated, and the debate is on my channel. If you guys want to go and take a look at that, we discussed his particular model of the Trinity, which is monarchical Trinitarianism. But yes, Dr. Bo's formulation of the LPT goes something like this. There's 7 premises. Premise 1, the Father is God. Premise 2, the Son is God. Premise 3, the Holy Spirit is God. Premise 4, the Father is not the Son. Premise 5, the Father is not the Holy Spirit. Premise 6, the Son is not the Holy Spirit. And premise 7, there is exactly one God. Now, if you recall from my previous video on the logical problem of the Trinity, which was in part 2 of this series, and I highly recommend, if you haven't, that you go in order and start out with part 1, working your way all the way down to this video, because I've tried to structure it in a way to where it will fit in this order going forward. So if you're not familiar with the material that I've given in the first 4 videos, I highly suggest you go back and watch those. But in part 2, I explain what the logical problem of the Trinity is. Now, The key issue is that it seems that if you are making three is God statements, that you're saying the Father's God, the Son is God, and the Holy Spirit's God, well, then that seems like three gods. But when you get to premise 7, you say that there's exactly one God, so it seems like a contradiction. Now, social Trinitarians, typically, the move they make to avoid this internal inconsistency is that they say the is God statements in the first three premises are what's called an is of predication rather than an is of identity. Now, what do I mean by that? An is of identity in relation to the Father is God would mean something like this: the Father is divine. Or another way to say it would be to say the Father is royal in that sense. So it's an is of what's called predication, which is something like a property that is ascribed to a certain individual. It's not an is of identity. Now, what is an is of identity? An is of identity is something like Bruce Wayne is Batman. So it seems like we're naming two different things, but they're really just one thing. If I say Bruce Wayne is Batman, it's an is of identity because I'm identifying Bruce Wayne with Batman. Or if I were to say, for anyone who's familiar with American baseball, Reggie Jackson is Mr. October. It's an is of identity because they're the exact same thing. Or likewise, recently we had Kobe Bryant, who was a famous NBA basketball player for the Los Angeles Lakers. His nickname was Black Mamba. So if I were to say Kobe Bryant is Black Mamba, it's an is of identity. It's not a is of predication or a quality that I'm ascribing to the individual. Literally, it's an is of identity because these two things I'm saying are identical to one another. Okay, so that's the difference between an is of predication, which is a quality ascribed to the individual, where an is of identity is saying that the two things are identical to one another. Okay, it would also be like saying Jake Brancatella is the Muslim metaphysician. That's an is of identity. So I hope that's clear for my listeners and those watching to understand what the difference is between an is of predication and an is of identity. Okay, so the social Trinitarians, as I said, the way they solve it is by saying that in the first three premises, the Father is God means something more like the Father is divine, or in the example I gave, royal, rather than an is of identity where you're saying they're literally these two things are the exact same thing. But then when it comes to premise 7, they equivocate on is God, and they say that is God, when you say there is exactly one God, it means an is of identity in the same way when we would say Bruce Wayne is Batman. So that gets you, it seems on the face of it, out of the logical problem of the Trinity, because you're not saying that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are identical to God, because then either you have modalism or it seems like you have three gods. What you have is it's an is of predication in those premises, and then when it comes to the 7th premise, you say there's exactly one God is an is of identity. So it seems to get you out of the problem because you are not saying that the Father and God are identical. It's an is of predication. It's a quality that's ascribed to the individual that is necessary and sufficient in order for it to be considered God or a God. Okay? Now, how does that solution and social Trinitarianism differ from relative identity Trinitarianism? Well, relative identity Trinitarianism, what it would say is, it would say these are in somewhat sense an is of identity, but it's an is of what is relative identity. So when you say that the Father is God, it just means, and you say that the Son is God, You are saying that the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit are all the same God. It's an is. They don't go the is of predication route like the Social Trinitarians. They say it's an is of identity, but in this relation, the identity is relative. Now, what does it mean for the identity to be relative? What they're saying is that the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God. That means they are the same God as each other. But then when it comes to the next three premises, the persons, they are not the same person as each other. So what you're left with is the Father, Son, and Spirit are the same God as one another. So that's why there's only one God. But they're not the same persons as each other. That's why there's three persons and not one person. Now, this commits you to what's called, as I said, relative identity. Now, in order for us to understand what is meant by relative identity, we have to understand what is meant by classical identity, or what's known as the law of identity. And I'm going to briefly explain four key functions or expressions of how we should understand the classical law of identity. Now, law of identity is typically understood as numerical sameness. Now, that means if we're comparing two things, they're really not two things, there's only one thing, because there just are numerically the same. In the same way that I said Bruce Wayne is Batman, in the same way that I said Kobe Bryant is Black Mamba, or Reggie Jackson is Mr. October, or you could even say, like myself, Jake Brancatella is the Muslim metaphysician. They're the same thing. It's just two names to refer to the same thing. So there's only actually one thing. We're numerically the same thing. Now, there's a difference that we need to understand between qualitative sameness and quantitative sameness. So qualitative sameness is not the same as quantitative sameness. And this discussion that we're going to have about when we talk about same God or same person is in relation to quantitative sameness. So the law of identity has a lot to do with quantitative sameness and how many things there are, so to speak, when we're looking at two things. Are they really two things, or are they really just one thing with two names to refer to the same thing? So, identity is a relation. As I said, it means to be numerically identical with two like objects. Now, there are four key things that we need to understand, as I said, about identity. Identity is transitive. Now, what do I mean by transitive? This means that if A and B are identical, and B is identical to C, then A is also identical to C. Okay, so it follows that if A is identical to B and B is identical to C, then A, by the law of identity and transitivity, A is identical to C. Transitivity means it's a relation between two things that carries over to the third thing that's in question. Now, that's pretty easy to understand, I think. Identity is also what we would call symmetrical. That means if A is identical to B, then likewise, B is identical to A. So I think that's also very easy for us to understand. If A is identical to B, then necessarily B must be identical to A. Now, third thing to keep in mind is identity is what is called reflexive. That means the relation can only apply to the thing and itself. An example of this in English grammar would be like to say myself. It's a relation that is can only apply to the thing, which is me, and itself. It reflects. Okay. Now, the fourth thing that I would like to explain about identity is that it assumes what's called indiscernibility, or that when you're comparing two things, that if they are identical, then you cannot discern between the two things. Okay, and a way to understand this, it's also known as Leibniz's law. So if you're not familiar with it, I suggest looking it up, and hopefully you will better understand what I mean. Now, Leibniz's law basically says that two things cannot be identical to one another if they differ at any time or timelessly. If you think that such thing as timelessness exists and you have two things, then they cannot differ timelessly, or in time, two things cannot differ simultaneously and be the same thing. Now, in logic, how this would be formulated would be to say that if x and y are identical, if and only if any predicate or property P possessed by x is also possessed by y, and vice versa. So that means whatever's true of x must be true of y, and whatever's true of y must be true of x. If they have differences, if there's something that's true of x that's not true of y, or there's something that's true of y that's not true of x, then they cannot be the same thing. So, once again, x and y are identical if and only if any predicate or property P is possessed both by x and y and vice versa. Okay, so if two things are really the same thing, then they never will differ simultaneously. That's what the law of identity says and Leibniz's law. If the two things in question differ simultaneously, then they are two things and not one thing. Okay? Now, how does this relate to what we were talking about with relative identity Trinitarianism? What relative identity Trinitarianism is saying is that you can have two things, which are, say, the Father and the Son. Okay, they're two persons, and they're both God, but there's only one God. Now, that seems to cast doubt on the theory of identity, or the law of identity. Why? Because if we say that the Father is God, and that we take that as a statement of identity, and the Son is God, and we take that as a statement of identity, then it would seem from the law of identity to logically follow that the Father just is the Son. That means they are the same thing. But wait, we can't say that they're the same because they're not the same persons. They differ from one another. Because if we were to say that the Father and the Son are exactly the same, then that would mean that we would fall into what's known as the heresy of modalism, which is to say that God is not really three persons. He's just sort of like one person that exists in three different modes, and we don't want to say that. So relative identity Trinitarianism is really proposed to deal with the problem of how two things can be the same type of thing, but also be a different type of other thing. So it would be like saying X is the same F, but X is a different G. So we don't really have any example of this that I can think of, or that even I think a lot of relative identity Trinitarians struggle to try to give, in which two things could be the same type of thing, F, but be a different type of thing, G. Okay? So in the case of relative identity Trinitarianism, they're saying the Father and the Son are the same type of thing, God, but a different type of thing, or a different sort of thing as a person. So they're the same God, but different persons. Now let's think of an example to try to bring this down to earth. If I say that you and I have the exact same cat, okay, we have the same cat, it's the same breed, it's the same everything, right? Are they the same cat? Now, we have to think about it. Well, your cat's name is Lucy and my cat's name is Johnny. And your cat lives in your house and my cat lives in my house. Are they the same cat? Well, no. By the law of identity, they can't be the same cat. Why? Because they differ in time. They differ in time, they differ in spatial location, they differ in name. Yours is a different name than mine, and it's not merely just a different name, it refers to a different thing. Maybe your cat is 1 day older than mine, I don't know. But the point is, in order for two things, the claim is, by the law of identity and Leibniz's law, if two things are the same thing, they have to be numerically identical. And in order for them to be numerically identical, they cannot differ in any way. So what does that say about the Father and the Son? Well, do the Father and the Son, and this is for Trinitarians, do the Father and the Son ever timelessly or in time differ? Well, of course they do, because the classical Nicene doctrine is that the Father begets the Son timelessly in eternity past, right? Not in time, okay? The Father begets the Son, but the Son does not beget the Father. So that means there's a property that distinguishes the difference between the two of them. Also, now in time, that's in reference to the immanent Trinity, or the differences in eternity past within between the persons. Now, in the economic Trinity, or the Trinity in relation to creation, the Father sends the Son doesn't send the Father. The Son dies on the cross, the Father doesn't die on the cross. There's differences between the Father and the Son. We can run the same type of example with the Holy Spirit. So I don't want to leave the Holy Spirit out, but we can run the same sort of examples with the Holy Spirit in relation to the Son, or also the Father. Now, who actually proposed this theory of relative identity? Well, it was actually a Catholic philosopher by the name of Peter Geach in the 1970s that proposed this sort of relative identity Trinitarianism theory, in which he actually claimed that relations of absolute identity are meaningless, and we can only speak about same types of things. So, like, if you were to ask whether or not Paul and Saul are the same, speaking of the New Testament figure, he would say that that question is meaningless. You cannot ask whether or not Paul and Saul are the same. You have to add what's called a sortal, or something that qualifies the thing in question. So you'd have to ask something like, are Paul and Saul the same man? Well, and then he would say yes. Are Paul and Saul the same apostle? Are Paul and Saul the same person? Yeah, you would say yes to all three of those answers. So what Peter Geach said is, to say, are Paul and Saul the same, is a meaningless question. So he said, in terms of classical identity, not only does it not hold for the Trinity, he says it doesn't exist in reality. It doesn't hold in reality. Okay? Now that is a very controversial claim, because typically the law of identity is one of the three classical laws of thought in classic logic. So Peter Geach was making a really controversial statements in regards to that. Now, there have been other modern day relative identity Trinitarians like Peter Van Inwagen, who wouldn't, it depends on how you read him, and some of his earlier works may differ than now, but for the sake of discussion, we'll say that Peter Van Inwagen wouldn't make such a strong claim. What he might say is that classical identity is very likely true and holds for most things in our daily life and physical reality in our experience. However, it doesn't necessarily hold for the Trinity. And so he would say that the Trinity cannot be analyzed in terms of classical law of identity type statements. They have to be analyzed in terms of relative identity type statements, in the way that you would say the Father is the same God as the Son. So they're the same type of thing, G, but they're a different type of thing, F. What is that different type of thing, F? They're different persons. So the Father and the Son are the same type of God, but they're a different type person. Now, we don't actually have any example of that. I gave the cat thing as a silly example, just kind of off the cuff, which you're free to reject, but I challenge people to think about, and I don't mean this in a like debate type of way, but I challenge us to think about, if we can come up with an example in real life in which two things are the same exact type of thing, X, but a different type of thing, Y. We don't have that anywhere. Now, Peter Van Inwagen, as I said, he doesn't necessarily deny the classical law of identity, but he says that in terms of the Trinity, it cannot be analyzed in terms of the classical law of identity. You have to kind of just throw it aside for the Trinity's sake. And he himself admits that it's found nowhere in reality besides the Trinity. So this is a quote from Peter Van Inwagen in a paper he wrote, which he says, "A philosopher who denies the existence of classical absolute identity may find materials in the procedure I have outlined for an explanation of the fact that most philosophers and logicians have assumed that there is such a relation as classical identity." So he's admitting that the claim of classical identity existing and being a true law of logic is held by most philosophers and logicians. So even if you want to take up relative identity Trinitarianism and use relative identity logic, which Van Inwagen proposes, he says that in reality, most philosophers and logicians would reject this sort of idea in general and even for the Trinity. He also, again, he states, "As far as I am able to tell, relative identity logic has no utility outside of Christian theology." So this is someone who is proposing relative identity Trinitarianism, and he admits that outside of Christian theology, relative identity logic has no utility outside of Christian theology or Trinitarianism. So that's a big thing to admit, because it seems to me, and it seems to even other social Trinitarians, and I'm going to give a quote from William Lane Craig, who also comments on this issue and would pretty much agree with my next statement, that relative identity logic and relative identity Trinitarianism almost seems like an ad hoc way of trying to get out of a specific problem, which is the logical problem of the Trinity, and to try to paint the Trinity as being logically consistent. It seems like a case of special pleading, because at best what you're saying is, unless you want to go the Peter Geach route and say, well, classical identity doesn't exist whatsoever. It makes no sense to say that Bruce Wayne and Batman are the same. You have to ask, are they the same man? Are they the same superhero? Or whatever you want to say. Unless you want to go that route and say that sameness or the classical law of identity doesn't hold for anything and it's a meaningless question, which even most people who are relative identity Trinitarians don't want to go that route. And if you're not going to go there, at best what you would have to say is sort of a case of special pleading, to where you say the classical law of identity seems, for all we can tell, to hold for everything else except for the Trinity. When it comes to the Trinity, we can't use strict classical absolute identity. We have to use something that's called relative identity, in which two things can be the same type of thing X, but be a different type of thing Y. And we just don't see any example of that, so it seems rather ad hoc and a case of special pleading. But William Lane Craig, who's a proponent of social Trinitarianism, which I respect Dr. Craig. I've critiqued his model of the Trinity and incarnation before, but he seems to at least agree with me on this point about relative identity Trinitarianism. What he says is, and I quote, "The so-called Athanasian Creed," which was an 8th century document, enjoins Christians to, quote, "acknowledge every person by himself to be God and Lord." And then Craig further in the same article says, "If these declarations are intended to imply that statements like the Father is God are identity statements, then they threaten the doctrine of the Trinity with logical incoherence. For the logic of identity requires that if the Father is identical with God and the Son is identical with God, then the Father is identical with the Son, which the same councils also deny. So what he's saying, by classical identity, if you take the statements the Father is God and the Son is God and the Holy Spirit is God as laws of identity, then it seems to follow that there's only one person. But that's internally inconsistent because you're saying there's three persons. If the Father is God and the Son is God, then it seems to logically follow, if those are ises of identity, that the Father just is the Son, which would be modalism, which is a heresy which the same councils deny. Now, William Lane Craig in the same paper said this: the fundamental problem with the appeal to relative identity Trinitarianism, however, is that the very notion of relative identity is widely recognized to be spurious. Finally, even granted relative identity, its application to Trinitarian doctrine involves highly dubious assumptions. For example, it must be presupposed that X and Y can be the identical being without being the identical person. Notice how different this is from saying, as he in his proposal says, that X and Y, the Father and the Son, are parts of the same being but different persons. The latter statement is like the affirmation that X and Y are parts of the same body but are different hands. The former is like the affirmation that X and Y are the identical body but are different hands. Van Inwagen, he says, confesses that he has no answer to the questions of how X and Y can be the same being without being the same person, or, more generally, how X and Y can be the same N without being the same P. So this is the whole problem of relative identity, is that it eschews classical identity and says, which again, I'm going to read another quote here from Van Inwagen's paper, which he proposes. He says, X is an F and Y is an F. X is a G, Y is a G. X is the same F as Y, but X is not the same G as Y. So he's saying that the Father and the Son can be the same X, they can be the same God, okay? But they are not the same person. And William Lane Craig is saying, look, we don't have any example of this. And even Van Inwagen is admitting this. So it's a really dubious claim to try to embrace and try to make that such a thing like relative identity exists. It seems ad hoc, and it also seems rather, it seems contrived to try to avoid a problem in Trinitarian theology. And it also, it just doesn't seem to add up. It doesn't make sense of how we can have two things that are the same type of thing, but are different of a different type of thing, because it just doesn't fit with the classical law of identity. So I hope for you guys that this was a brief enough but yet detailed enough explanation of what relative identity Trinitarianism is, how it relates to the logical problem of the Trinity, what is the distinction between its relation to Social Trinitarianism and the logical problem of the Trinity. I just want to briefly kind of recap those things, and then we can end this discussion, God willing. So the logical problem of Trinity is basically saying that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are God. They're all not each other. They're not the same person, but yet there's only one God. It seems that there would be three gods instead of one God. The Social Trinitarian says, no, look, if you see it as an is of identity, well, then what you've got is, if the Father is God and the Son is God, then the Father just is the Son. By the law of identity, it would seem to follow. So in order to get out of that problem, what social Trinitarians do is they say it's an is of predication, which is something more like a property ascribed to an individual, rather than saying these two things are identical to one another to where there's only one thing. So they get out of that problem. But what they have is an issue of trying to explain how there are these three things that seem so independent one another, how there is really only one God. On the other flip side, and William Lane Craig alluded to that, how he does it is basically saying each one of the persons are not fully God, they're parts of God, in the same way that a skeleton of a cat is part of a skeleton, which for me is problematic, because not just because of partialism, because the Trinity as a whole is this thing that is the one true God over and above, whereas the persons on an individual basis have a sort of not as high and proper divinity as the Trinity as a whole. It kind of results in a sort of subordinationism, in my opinion. There's a lot of other problems that I mentioned in my previous videos on, for example, social Trinitarianism, and more specifically Craig's model. But then how do relative identity Trinitarians deal with the problem? They don't deal with it in the same way. They don't say it's an is of predication and then just get out of it that way. They say it is an is of identity, but it's an is of relative identity. So the identity is relative. So they are the same God. They're the same type of thing, God, but they're a different type of other thing, which is a person. And so it seems to cast doubt on the law of identity, because what we know from the law of identity is that whatever's true of X must be true of Y in order for them to be the same thing. If they differ in any way, then they can't be the same thing. If they're different persons, then they can't be the same God. So if they're not the same God and they're both gods, that means they would be different gods, which means there would be two gods, or three gods in the case of the Trinity, which you want to avoid, and you don't want to say that. So, yep, that's kind of the summary that we talked about. We talked about the different things in relation to identity, that identity is transitive, that if A is identical to B and B is identical to C, then A is identical to C. We talked about identity being symmetrical, that if A is identical to B, then B is identical to A. We talked about identity being reflexive, that it's a relation that can only apply to a thing in itself. Example is like myself in English grammar. And identity also assumes indiscernibility, which is known as Leibniz's law. Two things cannot be identical if they differ at any time or timelessly. Another way to say it is X and Y are identical if and only if any predicate or property P possessed by X is also possessed by Y, and vice versa. So two things cannot be the same type of thing if they differ in any way. The Father and the Son differ in several key ways. For example, the Father begets the Son doesn't beget the Father Son sends the Son doesn't send the Father. The Son dies on the cross, the Father doesn't. So these are all ways in which they differ, so they cannot be the same. They cannot be the same God if they differ in any way by the law of classical identity. We talked about how Peter Geach in the 1970s is the one who kind of proposed this theory. Now, some have speculated that others earlier on in the tradition held similar views, and other philosophers have argued that this is sort of the only way that you can understand classical Trinitarianism and Nicene Orthodoxy. We talked about Peter Van Inwagen admitting that the classical law of identity seems to hold for things in general, and we don't see any example really in nature besides the Trinity in which this sort of relative identity exists. So relative identity logic seems to only have utility in terms of Christian theology and nothing outside of it. So it seems like a case in which this is a theory that is contrived simply to avoid a conclusion that is unsatisfying, and that is that Trinitarianism is inconsistent. And it also seems like special pleading because you're willing to accept it in many cases, the classical law of identity, but then when it comes to applying it to the Trinitarian God, we just sort of throw it by the wayside. We also spoke about William Lane Craig and his quotes on how relative identity seems to be spurious and doesn't really seem to have much utility outside of the Trinity as well. And it also, again, leaves you to saying that two things, X and Y, can be the same N without being the same P. And it just seems to contradict the law of identity, or at least say that it doesn't hold. So the reason why this is so important, and the reason why I want people to go back and think about these things more deeply, especially my Christian audience, is because in relation to some of my earlier videos, people will frequently say, well, look, Jake, there is no logical problem of the Trinity. And I'm talking about laymen, not the Christian academics that understand what some of these issues are, although we may disagree on some of their solutions, but they admit on a surface level what the problem is and they try to solve it. Others have said, no, Jake, you're just strawmanning the Christians. All you have to do is simply differentiate between being and person and the whole problem evaporates. Well, that's not true, guys, because if all you're saying is that the Father, Son, and Spirit are the same God, meaning they're the same being, but they're not the same person, then that leaves you with a form of relative identity Trinitarianism, which has serious theological and logical problems with it. That it doesn't seem to have any utility outside of Trinitarian thought, and it leaves you with the absurd conclusion of saying that X and Y can be the same type of thing N without being the same type of thing P. And it just leaves you kind of scratching your head a little bit. So I hope that, I know this is a lot for you guys to take in, and to be honest, I'm doing the best that I can to try to break these things down for you guys. But like I said, I really recommend reading the book that's called Theological and Philosophical Essays on the Trinity. I think it's published by Oxford Press. I think the editors were Michael Ray, and I don't know, the other name is escaping me, but you'll find it if you simply do a Google search. You may even be able to find a PDF for it. Just reading the intro of this book will give you a better grasp of these things. I'm really trying to expose Christians and Muslims alike to these ideas so we can get really deeper into the metaphysical differences between our faith, really try to understand who God is better, and then we can have better conversations with one another. So I hope that some of my videos are serving in, trying to further that goal. So I also will be having within the next few weeks, I will be starting a new show on my YouTube channel with a couple of brothers where we're going to have a call-in show and we're going to invite people on to discuss different topics. So you guys might find that interesting. Will be people like Sharif Abu Laith, Brother Yusuf Ponders from Pondering Soul, and another brother who you may not be familiar with, but we will be introducing you, Abdurrahman. So it should be interesting, and I hope you guys will enjoy that as well. Also, as I said, I will be having a couple Christian scholars come on my channel to discuss things like the Trinity and Incarnation over the next couple weeks. We got Dr. Ryan T. Mullins coming up in February. Dr. Joshua Ferris will be coming on in just a couple weeks, in about 10 days on the 21st, to discuss the Incarnation. And these are not debates, they're just interviews. And then also hopefully Dr. Joshua Sijiwade will be coming on some point, within the next month or so. So we got a lot of interesting things coming up. I hope that you guys were able to get hopefully just a better understanding of what this is. Maybe do some more research on it. And inshallah, I look forward to seeing you all soon. Assalamu alaikum.